Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a story tonight, because nothing beats a good story, and I'm so glad you've joined me. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Emily was in a tearing, frantic rush. Her body spoke of the fight or flight response. Her urgency to flee from the apartment that she shared with her mother at the speed of a rocket was pronounced. Her heart thundered in her chest like a booming drum. Sweat broke out on her upper lip, and she was more than a little flustered. She had dreadful, rather tormenting images in her imagination on how she'd be received at work if she was late. She really didn't want to upset Dr. Bollinger, who had an aversion to his staff arriving late. Thankfully, she didn't have to make any frantic decisions about what she would wear to work, as she always wore the same outfit again and again, a pair of white pants, a medical blouse, which she threw on fast, along with a white-buttoned cashmere sweater, which she could ultimately take on and off at will, depending on how cold or warm the weather was. It was early spring, so there was a sizable chill in the air, even though the weather hinted that summer wasn't an impossible dream, as each passing day was becoming brighter. It would seem summer was finally approaching, with a rather cautious reluctance and a vacillating hesitancy, as if the sun herself had decided to take an extended vacation. Emily ran to the bathroom to rigorously brush her teeth, to eliminate the foul, stale taste of a lingering morning breath that she could not stand. With fingers driven by the urgency of haste, she quickly tied back her long blonde hair into a practical neat ponytail. She carefully put on a touch of lipstick on her lips and some smoky eyeliner on the edges of her eyes. The black smudges appeared to bring out the gold and green flecks of her rather unusual eye colouring. She studied her reflection far too critically in the mirror, as she always did every morning. Although she was pretty, Emily was quick to see all her faults. She thought her nose was a little on the narrow side, rather off-centre, her chin a little too pointed for her liking, her face rather angular, and her skin far too pale. At least the makeup helped to bring colour back to her washed-out face. Let's just say her grandmother, on her father's side of the family, was always insisting that Emily should not spend too much time in the sun. As a consequence, it did mean her skin was perpetually as white as a snowdrop, and there were times that when she walked past her reflection in the mirror, she thought she was staring at a ghost, only to discover that she was actually seeing herself. Was she really that white? Emily's grandmother had said to her pointedly, when Emily was only 8 years old, "Look at me, and learn from me, my dear, and you'll be thanking me later on. I look like a lizard with my leathery skin. When I was your age, I parked myself in the sun like a Komodo dragon, and now I practically look like one, although I hope that I'm not that scary. So don't make the mistakes I did. I'd slather my body in ubiquitous amounts of baby oil and allow the sun to turn me into a gloriously golden colour. You see, back in my day, it was in fashion and sexy to bake in the sun. And at the time, I don't mind admitting, I looked terribly glamorous. But it didn't last, my dear. They don't warn you about things like that. Nothing ever lasts. When you're young, you can get away with practically anything. I'm paying big time for my foolishness now. The sun has prematurely aged me before my time, turned me into a wrinkled old prune that no amount of Botox or fillers can ever fix. And I don't want you to end up in the same unfortunate predicament as myself. Take a look at your beautiful mother. Learn from her. She wisely wore hats when she lived in Tennessee. And look at her. She hasn't got a single wrinkle on her face. She's never had Botox a day in her life." It was true. There was no kind way to say this, but Emily's grandmother did look like an old leather boot, that had been lying around in the sun for far too long, and had been exposed to the tumultuous wear and tear of the elements. So her grandmother's cautionary tale had hit home hard. So Emily never ventured into the sun for too long, without wearing a floppy sun hat, sun protective factor, and oversized sunglasses that swallowed up her entire face. Sometimes she privately thought she looked sickly pale, and wondered if a wee bit of sun would really be that damaging to her skin. Everyone knew the quintessential benefits of vitamin D, much that could be acquired from time spent in the sun, preventing all manner of diseases and inflammation in the body. It was being well documented of late, so perhaps sitting in the sun just for a few minutes every day might bring some much-needed colour to her complexion. Emily rocketed out of the door of her apartment, throwing herself together as fast as she possibly could. She suspected she looked like she'd been dragged through the hedge backwards. It was too bad. If her mother was up and about, she had no clue. She didn't have time to even say goodbye to her mother or exchange any kind of pleasantries. But Emily knew her mother would understand that she'd been running late, which for Emily was a first. She prided herself on being punctual. Emily began rudely brushing past people in the stairwell of the apartment block, barely acknowledging any of them at all, in her desperate urgency to get to work on time. She flung herself into her car, sagging into the leather seats like a floppy rag doll, pressing her foot down on the accelerator, and in the process stalling the car twice before she finally got it started. Come on, get a move on!" She practically growled at her car, as if it was a mulishly stubborn donkey that was refusing to budge and needed a double kick on the flank to coax it forward. Finally the engine sprang into action. The car purred like a satisfied tabby cat, while Emily tentatively weaved herself through Seattle's formidable unforgiving traffic, which seemed to have reached a deadlock. Horns were blasting, while chaos ensued on the roads. Someone had pulled down his window, was waving furiously and shouting out loud, "For God's sake, get a move on, will you?" And his furious indignance echoed Emily's own sentiments. Let's not kid, it was a perennial struggle, defeating the ungainly traffic day after day. But slowly and surely, Emily robotically battled her way to work, as if the automatic hard drive was written in her DNA, and played out day after day like an old record, recycling the same old tune. On this morning the traffic had been particularly challenging, rather tumultuous, like a storm you had to ride. Emily marvelled how whenever you were in a tearing rush, the universe always seemed to nurse a spiteful vendetta against you, as everything seemed to go badly awry. This morning was no exception to that rule, as one car had chosen to speed through a red light, as if the driver had taken it upon him or herself to play Russian roulette with his life, and inadvertently gone crashing into another car, and as a result the traffic had been badly strangled, as the two cars involved in the collision had unabashedly taken up both the lanes of the traffic. In a trice, police cars and ambulances with blaring invasive sirens had rushed forward onto the scene, with bright flashing red and blue lights. Policemen were waving you away, so you were forced to drive down one single narrow lane in a long straight line. It didn't seem anyone had been badly hurt in the collision, but it was unfortunate, fortuitous, uncalled-for mistakes like this that created a chaotic bedlam on the roads, and at this time of the morning nobody needed this kind of added stress. If Emily had left the apartment in a panic, she was even more pumped up with adrenaline by now. This was almost certainly proving to be a fine start to a rather inauspicious day. She wondered privately if getting out of bed at all had been a good idea. Little did she know that the harrowing journey to work would ultimately change the whole trajectory of her life. Was the universe trying to tell her inadvertently to stay away from town today? It seemed like a monumental struggle to even get to work in the first place. Finally, Emily found herself parking her car in the underground car park of the steel and glass building where she worked, which housed over 50 floors of offices, comprising all kinds of different businesses, from dermatologists' offices to chiropractors and accountants. Once she'd gone up the escalator to the elegantly carpeted reception area, she glanced through the glass doors of the building that overlooked the street. She could see the coffee shop over the road with its green awning, framing the windows, and its huge hanging baskets tumbling over with pretty hanging geraniums and spring pansies. She began to physically drool as she imagined swallowing that first warm cup of coffee, wallowing in the sweet aroma of the caffeine fix she so desperately needed. She was sorely tempted to bob across the road to satisfy and quench that compelling longing. Emily knew the next appointment was in 10 minutes' time. Dr. Wallace Bollinger did not appreciate her being slack on the job. He had already dismissed the last dental hygienist he'd hired in the practice, describing her as failing to be punctual and being rather cack-handed with her techniques in removing plaque from people's teeth. When Emily was given the job at the surgery, she had been told in no uncertain terms that timekeeping is everything in a dental practice. People did not want to be left hanging around, waiting in waiting rooms when they had other things to be doing. "Reputation is everything in this business," Wallace Bollinger had told her obsequiously. "You're only as good as your last returning patient. We want our patients to keep coming back. Competition is rife in this industry, and if our patients feel put out in any way, they'll simply just choose another surgery in a heartbeat. Our aim is to please our patients, make them incredibly comfortable, give them a desire to come back." Mr. Bollinger had rubbed his chin reflectively. "I hope you won't let us down like our last dental hygienist, Emily," he had said to her. "I'm very particular about the staff I hire. If you work well and are efficient and organized and arrive promptly at work on time, we'll get along famously." "I'll do my best, Dr. Bollinger," she had assured him. "I'm good at what I do, and I assure you I'm incredibly punctual." "Good, that's what I like to hear," said Dr. Bollinger, looking reasonably pleased. "Your surname is Riesling, and me and my brother are Bollingers, and with names of fine wines, hopefully we belong together," he had teased. Emily respected Wallace Bollinger. For sure he was a hard taskmaster, a punctilious, very skilled, proficient dentist that ran an efficient, tight but exceedingly organized ship, with his brother Nicholas at his side, who was his dental partner. True to his word, if you were reliable and punctual, the Bollingers treated you well. The patients liked the fact that they were never kept waiting for longer than 5 minutes. Wallace Bollinger and his brother Nicholas were very charming towards their patients, so that everyone left the surgery feeling as if they'd received extra special personalized treatment. Patients always came back for return appointments. Even the old dears were tickled pink by Wallace Bollinger's agreeable manner. They loved their dentist and told him the ins and outs of their daily lives, like they might their hairdresser, and he always made them feel welcome, so they were back as regular as clockwork for their 6 monthly checkups. Emily was without doubt an excellent dental hygienist, but on this morning she'd been running late. It had knocked the wind out of her sails. She really didn't want Dr. Bollinger to believe she was as flaky and ditzy as the last dental hygienist in his employ had been. But then at the very same time, she was not a robot on automatic pilot. Life happened. Sometimes spillages occurred. Surely Dr. Bollinger could understand that. If for once in her life she was actually late. After all, he wasn't an unreasonable ogre, was he? And she had to date never let him down before. Emily had no comprehension or idea how she'd actually managed to oversleep that morning. She had vigilantly set the alarm clock on her nightstand to go off precisely at 7:30 p.m, to give her plenty of time to overcome the unpredictability of Seattle's capriciously belligerent traffic, well renowned for being completely contrary at the very best of times. If indeed Emily's alarm had gone off, she had failed exponentially to hear it, and moreover her mother hadn't looked in on her to check she was up and about, which she would predictably normally do. Emily perceived, if she did in fact tell Dr. Bollinger all this, he'd likely believe it was a lame excuse, but it was a true one nevertheless. The coffee shop over the road seemed to be winking at her. Its glass window panes were caught up in a pretty ethereal light of this fresh spring morning. The saucer magnolia tree a few feet away from the shop, framed by the asphalt paving, was bursting with blossom and blowing gently in the breeze, some of its blossoms floating across the pavement like wedding confetti. Emily awkwardly juggled the floundering thoughts going around and around in her head. While she endeavoured to make a decision, she needed to be quick about it. Her body demanded this cup of coffee to get her day to a promising start. Her body was practically gagging for it. Until now, her day had been balancing precariously on a knife edge, threatening to go badly wrong. Things had not been good this morning from the very beginning since she'd woken up. So without the caffeine fix, her hands would wobble and tremble unsteadily during her dental hygiene procedures, and that would not be good. She knew this was all because early in the morning one's body needs more acid to bring up the blood pressure. It would seem that both sodium and caffeine boost flagging energy levels, calming down flustered, overwrought nerves, which is why the vast majority of people function so much better and efficiently after the first cup of coffee in the morning. Emily had read about this somewhere in a medical journal. It explained a whole lot to her, and explained why her morning jitters were a problem that she couldn't ignore. She had to get this cup of coffee. In the evening time, the body functioned on a more alkaline response, which is why abandoning stimulants like coffee before bedtime would help guarantee a good night's sleep. Too bad, she told herself. I have to get that coffee. I don't want to have fumbling fingers when dealing with my first patient this morning. I can pick up the coffee as quickly as I possibly can, and I'll be back to the surgery in the nick of time. She dashed over the road to the coffee shop, sighing with disappointment. It seemed as if the whole of Seattle couldn't get their day started without a coffee, as bundles of people were queuing up for coffee. It would seem all had the same idea as her. What was wrong with people, she mused. Why did they have to flock to exactly the same coffee shop as her? There were so many in Seattle. It was so inconveniently annoying. Why couldn't they go somewhere else? Emily reluctantly settled in the queue, behind a gathering of over a dozen people. But the barista behind the counter was efficiently quick, and the queue got shorter and shorter at a speedy pace, which was a huge relief. At least something appeared to be going halfway right this morning. She did, of course, know why people came to the Great Start coffee shop. The coffee they served was the best in Seattle, as far as Emily was concerned, and it was her best-kept secret. She continued to cautiously watch the time on her cell phone, and finally made it up to the barista. She let out a huge sigh, like you might do after completing a grueling marathon that had expunged all your energy reserves. The barista smiled at her sympathetically, as if sensing her angst. "In a bit of a rush today?" she asked. Emily nodded. "Don't worry, you're in good company," she said, with a blithe joviality. "This is Seattle. Everybody's always in a rush, aren't they? What will it be?" she asked Emily. "I'll have a mocha frappuccino," she told the barista, who handed her a coffee, and Emily felt instantly better, holding the frappuccino in her hand and inhaling the fragrant steam. Emily paid the barista, telling her to keep the change. She frantically dashed through the glass doors of the coffee shop, only to go flying into a handsome man that was entering the coffee shop at the very same time as she was leaving it. This she needed like a hole in the head. Her mocha frappuccino was indiscriminately flung from the confines of its container, from her hands, becoming airborne and crashing violently on the floor, splattering all over her perfectly white dental uniform, while some spilled over the man's meticulous pinstripe suit. For a moment all eyes in the coffee shop, that had heard the noise, were now focused on the unfortunate incident. Emily had gone as red as a field of poppies. She didn't appreciate being the embarrassing object of everybody's scrutiny. This man had made a spectacle of her. But people politely turned away, so as not to appear rude by impolitely staring at the fiasco. A waitress appeared on the scene with a bucket and mop, to wipe away the incriminating evidence. "Why didn't you look the hell where you were going?" snapped Emily indignantly. She stared down in abject horror at the steaming coffee stains, sploshed over her white outfit, like the paint on a Jackson Pollock canvas. The man reddened slightly. He looked quite shaken up by the unexpected steamy explosion that had sent coffee flying liberally over everything. He wiped away the excess of coffee, dribbling from the edges of his chin and from his pinstripe suit that he was wearing, with a gentleman's handkerchief that he pulled out of a pocket. He looked up at Emily apologetically. "Are you all right?" he asked, looking at her through concerned brown bird-like eyes. "I'm very sorry about all that." Emily could not hide her infuriation. She glared at the man, someone in the coffee shop who'd been seated at a nearby table, rushed forward to hand Emily a handful of serviettes to wipe off the coffee stains. She thanked them as she punched the serviette over the wet, steaming marks. "All right? Do I look all right?" Emily exclaimed. "You went flying into me. If you'd looked where you were going, none of this would have happened." She wiped down the white clothes that were now badly stained. "Lucky for you I'm not burnt," she chortled. "But you're completely to blame here. None of this is my fault," she said brazenly. "Are you blind or something? Don't you look where you were going? Wasn't it obvious someone would be coming out of the coffee shop?" "Ma'am, I think you ran into me. It wasn't the other way round," the man corrected her politely. "Don't you dare put this on me! Is that what you're trying to do? Who are you kidding? You walked into me! Haven't you got the decency to take responsibility for what you've done? Look at my clothes! I work at a dental practice over the road. I have to clean myself off in the bathroom because of what you've done. And I don't happen to have a change of clothes with me, so I'm going to have to wear this all day. And on top of it all, I have an appointment in mere minutes." "I'm sorry. Can I at least pay for your dry cleaning and buy you another cup of coffee to replace the one you lost?" "No, you can't," said Emily angrily. "You've already done enough damage. I'm drowning in coffee thanks to you. I don't need any more." And with that she angrily marched out of the coffee shop and crossed the road to the steel and glass building, and managed to clandestinely sneak into the bathroom to wash down her clothes still further and dry them with the air dryer. They'd have to do. She had managed to get most of the coffee stains out of the white fabric. Hopefully Dr. Bollinger wouldn't notice that her blemished white medical uniform was not quite so white any more. As it happens, he was so caught up in a conversation with Mr. Maraschino, a man whom the surgery knew well. He was a regular patient, as was his 35-year-old daughter Chloe and her 2 children. Dr. Bollinger appeared to be excitedly scrutinizing Mr. Maraschino's cell phone, staring excitedly at the footage, his body quivering. "Emily, come over here. See this," he called her, thrusting the cell phone into her hands. "Tell me what you see. Do you notice anything?" "What is all this about?" asked Emily, taking the cell phone from the doctor's hands and examining the footage. "All I see is trees. It's some kind of wood grove." "Look closer," said Dr. Bollinger. "Do you notice anything? Does anything stick out to you? Anything unusual, perhaps?" "I told you," said Emily. "I just see trees." "Mr. Maraschino believes he caught a Bigfoot on camera." Emily curiously examined the photograph with greater attention to detail. The subject of Bigfoot had always fascinated her. "But I don't see anything at all," she said, looking disappointed. "Over there," said Dr. Bollinger, pointing to the photograph. "Do you see that large shape hiding behind the tree there?" "I do," admitted Emily. "But it's like a huge bleary shadow. It could be anything. It's not concrete evidence that it's a Bigfoot, is it?" "I suppose not," said Mr. Maraschino. "But I assure you it absolutely is. I saw it with my own eyes, I did." "Tell Emily what happened," said Dr. Bollinger excitedly. "You need to listen to this, Emily. It's quite some story. You saw the Bigfoot close up and personal, didn't you, Mr. Maraschino?" "I did indeed," said Mr. Maraschino. "I hasten to tell you I got the shock of my life. I'm still recovering from the incident. I keep asking myself if it actually happened. I'm only disappointed that the photograph I took was so blurry, but it just can't be helped. I gave it my best shot, but unfortunately when I took the photograph I was shaking so much. That's why I suspect many pictures online are so out of focus when it comes to Bigfoots. When you're shaking like a blancmange jelly, you're going to take a very bad photograph." "I never thought of it like that," said Emily. "So what happened?" she said, unable to extinguish the flames of excitement rising up from the smouldering embers of her heart. "Well, as it happens, I was working on the vegetable bed in my backyard. I live in a heavily wooded area with my daughter Chloe, her husband and her 2 children. It's the quintessential house in the woods, so to speak. I have a spectacular vegetable patch where I grow absolutely everything you can think of. I was working tirelessly in the yard with my trowel, digging up the ground to plant some of my lettuces. Then I felt the pronounced feeling that I was being watched." He rubbed his chin and looked reflective. It's hard to explain, but I knew someone was watching me. I couldn't shake off the feeling at all. I know the feeling, said Emily. Anyway, I felt as if electricity was running up and down my spine. So I turned around to examine the trees behind me, but nothing was there. And then there was like this voice that came into my head. It almost chuckled and said to me, "You won't find me." I thought I was going crazy, because let me tell you, this voice was not my own. Something in the woods was trying to play peekaboo with me, or hide-and-seek if you like. "Are you sure someone was actually speaking to you?" asked Emily. "Could it not just have been your imagination, perhaps?" "Absolutely certain it was not my imagination," said Mr. Maraschino. "Anyway, I dropped my trowel and walked into the woods. I was determined to find out who or what was toying with me. I knew I was being played. So I began to thoroughly search the grove for, well, whatever was toying with me, although I had no idea who it was. But again, nothing was there. Incredibly frustrating it was. All of a sudden, I was suddenly showered with tiny pebbles. Something had thrown them at me, so I moved to where I suspected they had been thrown from, but nothing was there. It was infuriating. And then I heard the voice in my head again saying, "See, I told you you would never find me. You're not very good at this game, are you?" It was like this thing that was teasing me was rarely amused by my inability to find it. I could feel its presence. It was sizable, and it was close to me, almost as if breathing down my neck, like a disembodied ghostly entity of some kind. And yet I could not see this thing. Have you any idea how frustrating that is? It was driving me insanely mad. I'm telling you, I looked everywhere, but it was like looking for an invisible man. You know something is there, but you just can't see it. Eventually I shook my head, despairingly, like you do when you give up on something. I thought, well, I don't see anything. I'm just going to go back to the yard and continue with my gardening. And then I was showered with stones again. And when I say stones, I mean lightweight pebbles that can't hurt you, of course. I turned around and nearly fainted, said Mr. Bollinger, his lips quivering. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I think I was too shocked to react adversely, or even to be afraid. I think when you see something that challenges your sense of reality, you begin to doubt what you're seeing is for real. And for a moment you think you're dreaming. "Go on," said Emily. "What happened next?" This time Emily's eyes were widening, her heart flapping wildly in her chest, as she hung on to Mr. Marianto's words. "That's when I saw it," said Mr. Marianto. "I think it was laughing at me. I was so shocked to see it standing there. He stood there in front of me, larger than life, let me tell you. This thing was gargantuan. I guess it must have been 8 foot tall. So big, burly, covered with long dark hair. Its face was incredibly human. I mean, it was like looking at a giant man, covered with hair, and overlong arms and a bullet-shaped head, with virtually no neck to speak of. I'm not sure how long I stood there gawking at this thing. I was in utter disbelief, was completely confounded. The Bigfoot spoke to me again in my head, and he said teasingly, "You really aren't very good at this game, are you? Children would be better than you." I could swear it was chuckling at me, its eyes lively, bright and humorous. It turned around and glided away. That's when I remembered my cell phone, so I ran after it, but I was trembling so much as I tried to snap a picture of it in the trees. In that photograph he's glancing back at me over his shoulders, from behind that tree there, nodding at me again. "That's incredible," said Emily, looking bewildered. "How do you feel after your encounter, Mr. Marianto?" "Bemused, privileged, you could say," said Mr. Marianto. "It's definitely not a creature to be feared. At least the one I encountered isn't. He was clearly emotionally intelligent. He could communicate telepathically. It was an extraordinary experience. I keep pinching myself to say, did that really happen? But I assure you it did." Mr. Marianto's extraordinary account was anchored in her mind like a boat in its mooring place that did not leave her thoughts for a moment. If luck was on her side this morning, her patient was also running late. She could breathe again. The day had got to a flying and interesting start, but things would get progressively more interesting, if that were at all possible. Later that morning, after the day ambled quickly forwards, no other dramas ensued. Before long, Mrs. Thomas peeked into the surgery. "Oh, there you are, Emily, dear. I thought you were in here cleaning up after your last patient. There's a delivery for you at the reception downstairs, I believe." Mrs. Thomas was in her late 60s. She worked behind the reception desk at the dental surgery, and every day wore a signature different pair of funky spectacles, framing her grey-blue eyes. Today she was wearing bright pink frames. Emily didn't know anyone who could own so many glasses. If Mrs. Thomas wanted to, she could probably open her own optometrist's shop, because she had so many glasses. The pink frame she sported today flatteringly complimented the stylish, elegant pink woven jacket and skirt she was wearing. "What do you mean delivery?" asked Emily, looking up at Mrs. Thomas in surprise. "I'm not sure I'm expecting anything." "Roses, I believe they are. Isn't that exciting?" said Mrs. Thomas, studying Emily curiously. "Now, come on, Emily. What are you not telling me?" "Someone's got an admirer," she teased. "I told them down in reception to send up the roses to the surgery pronto, so they'll be here in a jiffy, I suspect." "There's got to be a mistake," said Emily. "It's definitely not my birthday. I don't know anyone who would send me roses, even when I dated over a year ago. Do you know, in the course of my 3-year relationship with Fred, he never once brought me even a pitiful rose, not even for Valentine's Day. I remember he said that Valentine's Day was too commercial, but I don't think he really believed that. I just think he was being tight." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Thomas, looking sorrowful. "Sounds like you've been dating the wrong kind of men. You've been going for stingy men. Now it's time to go for the generous ones. But maybe the tide has changed for you. Someone's taken it upon themselves to send you roses," she said with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "Oh, to be young again," she said, sounding almost envious. "When I was young, my boyfriend Kevin would always buy me dozens of red roses, but not any more. Those days are long gone, I'm afraid. Now Kevin, who's my husband, probably buys me flowers once a year if I'm terribly lucky. When I was young, he was so incredibly romantic, but he hasn't exercised that romantic muscle for a very long time, so I suspect it's atrophied quite a lot in recent years. Oh, here we are. Talk of the devil. The delivery man is here." Emily gasped when an enormous box of yellow, pink, white and lilac roses, tied up with a curvaceous purple bow, arrived in reception and was presented to her by Mrs. Thomas, so elegantly wrapped up in tissue paper. The label was definitely addressed to Emily Riesling, which was written in capital letters on the outside of the package. "I told you," said Mrs. Thomas proudly. "Somebody's got an admirer. You have to admit it. Go on, Emily. Tell me who he is." Emily looked up at Mrs. Thomas with a nonplussed expression on her face. "I'm as bewildered as you are, Mrs. Thomas. I have no idea who sent me these roses. I can promise you, even as I speak, my love life is as bland as a bowl of undressed lettuce. I've not seen anyone in the last year since I broke up with Freddie a year ago." Mrs. Thomas examined the box. "Well, they really are for you, Emily. It says to Emily Riesling on the outside of the box. So whether you know it or not, you've got an admirer. Why don't you open it up?" "They're beautiful roses," Emily exclaimed. "Whoever bought them for me has got extravagant taste and is exceedingly generous." So there we are. That's the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.